Hi, we can see some numbers coming in. Welcome, everybody. Welcome along. Hi, it's Kathy Frey here from IMCO, from the International Integrative Maternity Healthcare Organisation. And welcome to today's Maternity Natural Health webinar. And we have Chantal with us today. Have a wave. Give everyone a wave.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And Chantal is from New York. And so we've just been in the green room having a bit of a chat about COVID-19, of course, and which is always a topic of conversation. And we're just going to sort of let everybody just sign on in, and then we'll get going with this webinar. So just a reminder to everybody here, it's just so great to have you here. You know, there'd be no point in doing this if we don't have you guys here live. And please go into the chat area down the bottom and put in whereabouts you are from and your role. If you're a health practitioner, a birth practitioner, you're a mum with a pregnant belly to be. So yeah, anything, let us know. That's always really interesting. And also down the bottom is the Q&A section. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask Chantal, then just please put that in there and we'll absolutely make sure we get through them before we get to the end of today. And we've got some people starting to sign in here, which is awesome. And oh, we've got another doula from Brooklyn here. So we're going from New York to New Zealand and around the world and back to New York. So that's just wonderful. And Rhode Island, USA, Christchurch, New Zealand, Nashville. That's awesome. Nashville, Tennessee.
Hi, Carrie.
I recognize the names. Sydney. Oh, it's just great to see you all here. And Atlanta. Okay, fantastic. Look, just wonderful. It's always great to catch up with everybody. So we will. I think that we'll probably get going now because we've probably got most of you signed on in. I have to say we had the highest number of registrations for this particular webinar that we've had so far in the entire series. So obviously the pelvic floor has hit a spot for a lot of people. So that is just brilliant. And this whole knowledge around the birthing of that second stage. So just an introduction properly to Chantal Traub. She's been assisting expecting families in New York since 2003. She's a doula and a childbirth educator and a women's health coach. And Chantal is passionate, as you'll hear, about educating and informing women about the pelvic floor health during pregnancy and how to train the body and the mind for an easeful and positive birth experience. Oh, and we've got some more people popping their names up here. It's just wonderful. Please do sign into the chat. Let us know where you are, who you are, what you do. We've got New Zealand coming in now and some more from New York and Melbourne, Victoria. Oh, it's just fantastic. Fantastic. So Chantal, as I say, lives in Brooklyn. And she's with her 9-year-old and 12-year-old and their bearded dragon. And so I'm going to hand over to you now, Chantal, and let you introduce we're not going to be doing a formal PowerPoint today. We may use some PowerPoint slides, Chantal may choose to, but we're going to be doing a bit more of an organic chat today. And so please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your story, kind of who you are and why you do what you do.
Thank you, Kathy. It's so great to be here and such an honor to be chatting with you. And I love your work and I love following your work. So this is really exciting. So I am Chantal Traub and I'm originally from South Africa, Cape Town. I don't know if you knew that, but I have an affinity for Kiwis because
I can hear the South African accent. We have quite a lot of them in New Zealand.
Yeah, and I've never been to visit. I heard it's beautiful there. I'd love to sometime. Yeah. But I've been in New York a long time, and I've been, practicing. I'm an active birth doula. I'm still assisting birth since 2003, and, assisting hundreds and hundreds of expecting families here in the New York metro area. And I have a background in yoga. I've taught yoga since 1996 and childbirth education, as well as coaching clients either for birth, through postpartum, and into perimenopause. But what I found from going to hundreds and hundreds of births is that moms were often underprepared for the pushing part of labor. And what I would find is often they would push really forcefully into their faces, creating broken blood vessels or broken capillaries, or pushing really forcefully into their abdomen, sometimes making the diastasis that they already had worse, or sometimes creating or pushing really forcefully into the pelvic floor, sometimes sustaining, long-term weakness and damage, and sometimes unnecessary tearing. And I, as a childbirth educator, I'm certified through Lamaze and through Childbirth Educators of Metropolitan New York. So I've done lots and lots of studies of childbirth education, and we're often taught to teach for physiological birth, and we would teach a childbirth class and spend like 2 minutes on pushing and carry on. And I'd go to birth and I'd be like, sometimes pushing more often is, the shorter time of labor. But if things go right, they have such lifelong lasting repercussions. And I just felt like, why aren't we talking about this? And I would bring it up with some of the midwives and the OBs that I was working with, and would say, like, shouldn't we be preparing our moms better? Isn't there a better way to prepare our moms? And the answer that I would often get is, well, not really, because they only have to figure it out on the day, like the day or night. They only have to figure it out once, because once you have given birth, the next time is so much easier. Which may be true, but not always, because sometimes I would find they would push, or often I would find ineffectively for hours, working against themselves. Sometimes, running out of time and having a C-section, sometimes ending up with a vacuum, a forceps, or even a episiotomy. Now, sometimes, yes, of course, they're valid, but sometimes it was just from uncoordinated, ineffective, inefficient pushing, or really, really understanding the physiology of what's happening with the baby, what's happening with their bodies, and the function and the role of the pelvic floor.
Yeah.
And
I
as
think
it,
it's
yeah,
when you really knock the nail on the head when you sort of say that, how long do we spend in childbirth education even discussing, techniques of pushing? It is a very sort of wiped over type of topic, isn't it? And so you've created classes that are specifically just around the education of the second stage and the pelvic floor. And that's just fascinating. How long are the class, like when you do that, how long do you talk about that topic when considering in a childbirth education class? Usually it might be talked about for a few minutes, so your classes are a lot longer than that.
Yeah, I mean, my classes are, anywhere between 2 to 3 hours. I mean, I could talk all day about it. There's so much to learn about, our bodies, and especially, our baby has to pass through the pelvic floor. But the role and function of the pelvic floor is so essential for quality of life. It's
right.
So
what say is like the commonest question that you get asked?
Yeah, I want to answer that, but I just want to dial it back, because what
Yeah.
I also started noticing parallel as a yoga teacher, some of my older students would share with me that they would, they know that I was a doula, and that, they'd hear my stories of births and things like that. And they would often share with me, now these were moms who had their kids 10, 15 years ago, and they would share with me that they were still suffering some type of pelvic pain, some type of incontinence with either sneezing or jumping or even a prolapse. And then I began to realize that as we age and our bodies change, and the fascia and the tissue, starts thinning, often those obstetric events from the past are going to catch up with us. And I was like,
Right.
prevention.
Can I ask out of curiosity, was there like almost a theme of the age for women when you'd sort of start to hear those comments from them?
Not really, because that's where it started my classes. But then when I was with my kids in the playground, I would meet someone for the first time and they go, "Oh, you're a doula. Let me tell you about my birth story."
Yes.
So
Yeah.
often it would be this amazing birth story that they just want to share with someone who gets it.
Yeah.
But more often than not, it would be about a disappointing birth experience, a traumatic birth experience, or that they were sharing that they were, scared of bounty houses and wouldn't go on the trampoline because they would leak and it was normal, or right? It's just heartbreaking because they were holding it. Or I would even be at like a dinner party with new people and, let me tell you about my story.
Yes.
And this is what I'm still experiencing. And I thought it was just normal. It may be common, but we can still work with these things.
Okay. So yeah, we'll need to let you start to impart some of your practical wisdom. So I might I'll stop asking you a question for the moment and let you maybe no, it's good. And because let's hear what it is that you're teaching. That would be great.
Well, I'll just share that question that you asked. Like my number one top question that I get from pregnant moms, it's like always the top question is, how can I have a more easeful birth and how can I minimize damage? How can I not tear? So there is this fear around tearing and damage. There is. So and there's lots of fears and concerns about say pain, and so one part of it, I think very much so, is learning about the body and just understanding how the body is prepared to let the baby out. Like it's functionally that can do that. So and talk about how physiologically the body is prepared to give birth if it's well supported and the function of hormones and things like that, so that we start peeling back the layers of the anxiety and fear and see what else is there. So that is a large part of the work and something that is sometimes addressed in childbirth education classes, but not always. And I think even especially now during COVID, like there's always uncertainty and fear around birth, but even so much more, we are,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's such a very difficult time when you're pregnant. Personally, I think that probably pregnant women around the world have not been this worried about being pregnant and giving birth, probably for Westerners since World War II. Do you go to the hospital? Is that or do you give birth at home? Is it safer at home? It's just there's so many questions. You want to do the right thing, and it's depending on where you are, and it's very, very tricky. Okay, so how do you start to prepare your clients, their whole body and mind, and how do you do that preparation, and then what are the results that you see from that preparation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always thought let's learn about our bodies, first of all, so I generally teach about, the part of the body that the baby has to pass through. And so that's our, our bony pelvis, this beautiful bony bowl. I love, it's made up of 4 bones. I absolutely love the pelvis. They have 2 large bones that look like elephant ears. My young son used to call them elephant ears, that wrap around and join at the pubic symphysis. Then we have our sacrum and our little, bony coccyx. And then we have those joints, the pubic symphysis and the 2 sacral iliac joints. And understanding that this pelvis, which is really cool, but what's the function of the pelvis really is to protect our soft organs. And in the female pelvis, the lower organs are going to be our bladder, our uterus, and our rectum, which are supported with and against each other and by the pelvic floor. So understanding, okay, what, in here, first of all, And I would go into depth about how the bones move and things like that, and we can today too, if you want, but to really understand, the pelvic floor and the function of the pelvic floor. So there are many layers to the pelvic floor, but the deep pelvic floor muscles, the diaphragm of the pelvic floor, attaches at the middle of the pelvis at the ischial spine. So that's like the middle of the tunnel of the pelvis. So for those out there that are moms for the first time, if we look at our pelvis, it's wider at the top and narrow at the bottom. It's kind of like funnel shaped and it's curved inside. And so it's not a straight descent, it's not a straight drop. The baby has to navigate these bones and has to do a lot of bending and turning to manage to pass through the bones, but then it also has to pass through the pelvic floor. So the deep muscles attach right at the middle, which is the narrowest part of the pelvis, at the two ischial spines. They attach around S3, S4 at the middle of the sacrum and at the middle of the pubic symphysis. And trajectory of the baby, for example, as it comes down into the pelvis. And a lot of the preparation that I spend with my clients and my students is really understanding, even ahead of time, to kind of balance the body and set the body up ahead of time so that the baby's coming down in an ideal way.
So what sort of thing are you saying for them to do to set themselves up for that?
Okay, so let me just finish one last question, and then
Yes.
I'm gonna, because these are all important, but I don't want to forget this. At the very bottom of the pelvis, actually outside of the pelvis, are superficial muscles of the pelvic floor, predominantly the perineum, which attaches the ischial tuberosities, the sit bones, little base of the coccyx, and underneath the pubic symphysis. And so the baby, once it passes through, then it will have to slide across the perineum before it, kind of extends and come underneath the pubic symphysis, passes the two bones and pubic symphysis, and then, it turns its head. We'll go back to that, turns its head on the perineum, the shoulders turn on the perineum. So right away, just understanding that a balanced, well-balanced, supple pelvic floor aids with those babies' rotations. So, because the baby, once it leaves the cervix, it doesn't come into contact with anything really firm until it comes down onto a pelvic diaphragm. And then a supple, balanced pelvic diaphragm is going to help with that baby's rotation. And as it passes through the pelvic diaphragm, and then starts descending down further, it will slide across the perineum. And we want our perineum to have the ability, if it's supported enough, to be able to soften and firm and efface and soften and firm and efface and stretch around the baby's head right before. But so the way that I first start off is we learn about our pelvis, and we learn about the pelvic floor and the function of what the pelvic floor does and why we want to protect it and as much as possible and support it, right? Because, life happens, of course, and then there are amazing, professionals that I would send people to if they needed some support and help. But ideally, we prevent, rather than cure. But so starting off, just understanding in a first-time mom that the uterus has a curve to it, and we want our baby coming down following that curve of the uterus, which is curved on the left and angles more straight down on the right in a first-time pregnancy. After that's a little bit stretched out, so it doesn't really have to matter so much. But we want to support our baby coming down following that curve, ideally so that it's tucking its turning towards its chest and leading with the narrowest part of the head, which is the most malleable part of the baby's head. So the last few weeks of the pregnancy, really just from around 37, well, I often start at 35 weeks kind of thinking about it, but at around 37 weeks, encourage them with exercises and positions to support the baby coming down more in an ideal position so that it enters the pelvis already in an ideal position, so that it will continue, ideally leading with the narrowest part as it begins to start navigating the more narrower channels, which leads to the baby's rotation. But so I will teach about the baby's physiological movements, because often it's like the fear is just tell me how do I get the baby out of me? What do I have to do, right? But
Right.
if we dial it back and understand what does the baby need to do to be able to navigate through the pelvis? What does the baby need to do in order to come into, through, and out of the pelvis? And how can we support that? So that we, the mom, is the vessel and the baby is leading. The baby is the driver. We're the vehicle. So it takes the pressure of us, and we start thinking about connecting to our bodies and our baby, so we can support the baby to make it an easier path for the baby.
Yes. So it's kind of having that mind shift of away from saying, how can I give birth to my baby better? And swapping that for saying, how can I support my baby to birth itself? Yeah, it's kind of realizing that there's two people involved in this, and it's not all her responsibility, but supporting the baby to do that. And I think that yes, and certainly I've been such a huge advocate myself of not dumbing stuff down to our women, and I think that a lot of general literature and stuff that's out there is sort of taken to the most basic level, and women can handle, you know, a higher level of knowledge, and not dumbing it down and getting that pelvis out, and then realizing it's not about their baby being birthed through their vagina. Yes, it is, but it's their baby being birthed through their pelvis.
The pelvis, but then also not just navigating the bones of the pelvis. That's kind of simplifying it. You know, it has to, you know, pass the bladder, pass the rectum, come through the pelvic floor. It has to navigate, you know, those deep, you know, muscles in the front, the deep transverse abdominal muscles, those deep psoas muscles, those deep multifidi muscles. There's lots of ligaments, you know, the round ligaments and the broad ligaments. So we want a body that's supple, not too tight. So I think that often the idea is we have to get really buff to give birth, but it's really about balancing the hard and the soft. We want to be strong for the marathon of labor, but we have to soften to let the baby out. And here in New York City, right, so it's a really hard concept. You know, there's obviously people from all over the world, but here, like often our moms too are sometimes a little bit older. They're very independent. They very in control of their lives, their careers. They just, you know, really, you know, in charge really of everything. And I often find, so just dial it back. Well, I'll take a history with my clients, for example, when I work one-on-one, and then I sow the seeds to my classes, is that when I'm interviewing my client, or when we start working together, I go back in the history, like, what did you do as a young child, or what did you do in college, and what do you do as an adult for exercise? And when I'm hearing stories like, oh yes, I danced since I was 4, and I did gymnastics since I was 6, and then I did horse riding, and, you know, fell a few times and fell on the ice rink.
Oh, and by the way, I'm a Pilates instructor as well, and you start getting all these red flags of, oh my goodness, she's got the strongest pelvic floor ever. It's never going to release.
Yeah, or and it's the same thing. I spend 6 days a week and I do CrossFit. You know, it's just, we do a lot of the same also. When, you know, we walk, we sit, we're in cars. So then it's like, okay, all right, now we have to find out how to balance that. And I'm a huge advocate for physical therapists and myofascial release practitioners and osteopaths. So sometimes if I think like, okay, I would love for you to go see someone just to get a sense of, like, you know, how tight these obliques are, how these transverse, or the, you know, the rounding and the, you know, just to start working with the body, you know, that would, if I see a red light, I'll start making suggestions. But also there are ways in our own life that we want to look at the way that we move in space, our habits, our patterns, that really affects the body. So, I mean, I'm happy to share some of the release work that I do, but it's kind of looking at like the whole package, and then obviously the mental, emotional body as well.
Yeah, I would certainly say as a midwife, uh, some of my longest second stages have been women who are, they've just got really strong pelvic floors. And there's a, there's, and often I hear still people being told, oh, you should be doing your pelvic floor exercises, in your late pregnancy. And personally, as a midwife, I'm like, no, don't,
Yeah.
don't. We want a soft, yielding pelvic floor after you give birth. Yes, definitely, you turn your kegels in, but not beforehand, And
Yeah.
yeah, I've definitely seen correlations between, horse riders and Pilates instructors. That would be my
Yes.
two
And
favorite.
yogis too.
Yeah,
I teach this class at yoga studios because they have sometimes, not always, of course, but often they have difficult labors and they don't
yeah,
understand. Like,
yeah,
you want to soften. There's a softening that happens, and I do teach us
absolutely.
like we want to create a spacious nest for our baby to be able to, we do want to be strong, but we really want to balance that. There's
Yeah,
a balance.
yeah, absolutely. Now let's have a little look at some other things that I had a little note down that I wanted to ask you. Um, so what differences do you see with the people what's the change that you see with the people who will learn more about their pelvic floor? Because I guess you must see them in the class and then you see them at the birth, and you can see that difference of their empowerment, of their education. So do you sort of go right through the technical things of physically how they're pushing and through the classes, and what are you saying to them to do or to not do?
Yeah. So, look, there's not one way to give birth. There isn't. I do take into deep consideration, like, going to many different hospitals and birth centers and homes. So, yes, if I want to support, physiological pushing. If you're coming in and you're like, or I'm not going to tell you how to push. Your body's doing it. But here, for example, in New York City, there's two different things. There is like often like a 90% epidural rate in a lot of the hospitals. A lot of my own clients are choosing unmedicated birth, but that's the the 10%.
Right.
So my classes are, it's not that I have an agenda, one or the other. It's about the role and function of the pelvic floor. I want my clients to have a positive birth and a full recovery and really minimize damage. So like I want them to be healthy. I want them jumping on the trampoline when they're 90, but that's I want them to have. And so, and then also, as you mentioned, that hypertonic pelvic floor, where I would find that they were fighting against themselves, like they're pushing and they're actually pulling up. And so how do we learn that? It's very hard in the moment. Like, yes, when I join my clients in labor, I have hands-on and I'm reminding them, but I'm teaching to large groups of people. And I want them to start thinking about it, internalizing it, almost sensing it in your body, practicing ahead of time. Not necessarily the pushing part, but getting a sense of it ahead of time. Like, and when you connect the dots, it makes so much sense. And then my clients, yes, they feel much more motivated to do the exercises and some of the release work and prepare their bodies. But then
And they
also
and they obviously must also just feel less fear, because so often I think that before we give birth as women, we assume that the birth is the kind of worst part of natural childbirth, and actually it's not. It's the advanced active transitional stage, which is really the peakiest part of and once people and explaining to them that that the labor and the birth are such two different parts to it. Yeah, so that losing that fear of realizing that it's a mechanical thing, we're just pushing a baby through. And yeah, I think it's just fantastic what you're doing. How do you integrate that you know, for say other doulas or childbirth, or say other doulas or birth practitioners, midwives, etc. How are you integrating your knowledge with the clients? So how long would, you know, let's say you've got people who are not attending your class, but they are still going to be seeing you. I mean, how long would you spend chatting with them about this, about the second stage?
Okay, so if, for example, if it's my own, a lot of my own clients take the class, I do encourage them because I have my, you know, few 2, 3, 4 prenatals, and there's so many other things to cover. What I do cover with my own clients, and I do offer for people that are not my own clients, like a 2-pack session, is the preparation of not necessarily the second stage, but preparing the body to start coming down into the pelvis in the ideal way, and preparing the body to balance the body, and then, you know, exercises and positions to encourage babe to come, you know, to avoid those, you know, long hard labors and those long post days, to avoid inductions, because here they strict with inductions.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions that we've had come in is what's your advice and thoughts on rotating a baby? You know, when you know that you're pregnant and carrying an OP, you know, you've got a posterior lie baby. What's your thoughts in there?
So you know, so yeah, so like generally, like the idea is like big babies, or little babies, they all kind of turn at the end. Sometimes I find the big babies and the little ones do turn right at the end, but I don't want to leave it to that because I know what happens if you run out of time. Mm-hmm. And there's not much tolerance for many different things. So I absolutely encourage, and I'm quite on my clients with encouraging babe to come down in, you know, an LOA or an OA position before they go into labor and start coming down into the pelvis. If that baby hasn't started descending into the pelvis 38 and 9 weeks, I'm sending them to an osteopath, you know, body worker, because there's something going on, and then working a lot on positioning, or how they're hanging out at home, you know, like especially during COVID. Are we hanging out like on our little tailbone? You know?
Yeah, that's pretty much the worst position to get your baby into a good position, and we spend a lot of time in that way. Yeah.
So I'm looking at, like, yeah, just like how are you spending time, how are you spending your days, and then I'll give them like exercises and things to do to ideally encourage baby to come into an optimal position. So, and there are some, you know, I feel like I have a lot of success with that if we start early enough. So we'll start at 35 weeks.
What's some of the main advice that you'd be giving?
So ideally, this little, well, there's a lot. So if someone's done like their gymnastics and their Pilates, or they're just super, super strong, and sometimes it's just too tight to allow some of that movement, that rotation. So it could be bone, it could be soft tissue, it could be ligamentous. So I'm not only looking at the bones of the pelvis. Like I would start there, but I'm kind of looking at the whole body, taking a whole body approach to the person that I'm helping, whether it's my own client or just a private client that's coming to me for coaching or for sessions. And also take a look at their history, for example, right? And their beliefs. I take like a whole kind of approach. I'll even go into, you know, basic nutrition and sleep and hydrate, like all of that. We'll go through everything, but then we started looking at like posture, alignment, how they sit in, you know, either my sessions like are either on Zoom or they're in home. So I'm already getting a sense of them in their home, right? Right away from the get-go, I can see. And then, for example, so let's just go back to how we're sitting in our culture a lot, sitting on this tiny little tailbone that was not really designed for sitting on, basically. And if we look at the pelvic floor, the superficial muscles of the pelvic floor that attach at our tailbone, our pubic symphysis, and our 2 sit bones, our ischial tuberosities, right? So it makes kind of like that baseball diamond, if you will, like a sacred diamond. Mm-hmm. And in the front, from the pubis symphysis, you know, to the ischial spine, we have like our anterior triangle, and then we have that posterior that supports the urethra and the vagina, and then we have that posterior triangle that supports the rectum and the anus. Now, when you're sitting, I find, and there's a few things here. So when you're sitting a lot in this kind of position, we're actually weakening and tightening that posterior triangle. Also, as we become more pregnant, what often happens is to balance, the sense of the belly and the baby and the placenta and all the amniotic fluids, we kind of like turn our feet out, tuck our tailbone in. So we're weakening our glutes and our hamstrings, and we just tighten this posterior triangle, for example. So right away, I'll start looking at posture and alignment so that we're aligning our diaphragm above our pelvis, and just kind of activating those glutes and those hamstrings, and like releasing here these hip flexors a little bit. And then I'll teach you that you can sit and lean back a little bit, be at the back of your sit bones, but you don't want to be on your coccyx. So ideally you're on your sit bones, or you could be slightly back. Sitting on, a ball is great because it, brings you into an anterior tilt. You can't be tilting back like that. But the reason why I'll explain why it's important that we don't want to weaken and tighten this posterior triangle is because when the baby's coming through the pelvis, right? So it kind of comes down into the first part of the pelvis, and now as it comes deeper into the pelvis and starts parting those two ischial spines, ideally it's turning to face its mom's back, and then allowing the sacrum and tailbone to move out of the way. As the baby comes against the pubic symphysis, it tucks its chin in even more, right? As it moves that tailbone back, and it has to slide and stretch that posterior triangle first before it slides across the perineum to come forward anteriorly. And that's where I see those anterior tears. If we're not able to allow that posterior triangle to lengthen and move back, right, that restricts it, or it's weak, then the tears are more anteriorly. So we want that to be able to lengthen back before the baby then comes forward, and now beginning to lengthen and stretch the whole perineal body there. But so understanding that whole kind of sacred diamond has to be able to lengthen. So I'll start looking at posture and alignment and the way our moms are sitting, but then introducing some stretches where we find length in that posterior triangle. So if it would be, and I could even share an image of this, but if you kind of hang, like either holding on to, those doorknobs that have those bolts that go through those, so they're quite strong, and you could hold the side of the bar. Or some of my clients here, their sink in the kitchen is like the right height. You can hold on and you can lean back, get some movement here. But you find in length in that posterior triangle. So it's kind of like a hanging squat. You could hang off something and breathe and inhale and feel that expansion.
That's fantastic. That's something really practical and easy that they can be. Yeah, it's a great little exercise.
Yeah, and just breathe into that pelvic floor, because that's an area that has to find that length. Another one is like that happy baby pose. The one, if they can't be on their backs, you can kind of, do you know which one that is, Kathy?
The happy baby pose.
No,
I haven't heard that.
Okay, it's a great pose. Now, if the mom doesn't want to be on her back, I actually don't have a bolster here, but you could kind of support your body so that your organs are more lifted, right? So you would come onto your back, and you don't have to be here, but you could be here, and just breathe and allow an inhale and feel your sit bones widen, pubic bone away from tailbone, and kind of just think of like, people talk about a blooming flower. So you could just, breathe in that way. And of course, if you don't want to be on your back, you can support yourself on a bolster, so you're like a little bit more upright. But you could do it in a child's pose as well. Inhale, feel your sit bones. So you're feeling that expansion and breathe in. Like the breath so I always, the breath is just like the most beautiful gift that we have, right?
I think I have to say that the child's pose particularly is great. I actually was involved as a research midwife at Auckland University, involved in a study where we were looking at what happens with blood flow for the woman when they're lying on their back and they're heavily pregnant. And I have to say, yeah, that's not a good position for the blood flow, but that child's pose of that leaning forward and dropping, and I really do love that holding on to the kitchen sink type suggestion, as you say, stretching that posterior part of the perineum, which is not really something that people talk about very much within the industry, really, in pregnancy. So we've got some other questions coming in here. How can you, perhaps we've sort of covered this a little bit, but you might have more to add. How do you help women have an intact perineum in pushing and sort of feel good when they get to that second stage? Is there sort of like some differences that you're doing in the birth room to protect that perineum?
So part of the classes is really understanding second stage, which we didn't kind of dive into here. But I do follow the National Institute of Health and Care, the NICE guidelines, where they really, really clearly, explain or describe it as like, like in the first stage of labor, there are different phases. We have our latent phase and our early and active and very active. But so in second stage, there's different phases, and what often happens is, the first stage of labor, cervix often opens and opens and to the size of the baby's head. So second stage of labor is defined as 10 centimeters until the birth of the baby, but there's so much more in that, right? So often, so just really, really, really explain that. Often those, you get to fully dilated, and those contractions may space out. Now, often what you see is in the hospitals sometimes is like, oh, where did those contractions go? Well, let's give you some Pitocin and, finish this up. Or where did those, contractions go? Or let's just start pushing. The baby's still quite high up. So I will teach about the different stations, and ideally, as the baby comes lower, where ideally once the baby's on the perineum. So, but if we go back to the NICE guidelines, it describes it very well that, if the contractions space out and mom's doing okay and baby's doing okay. So we're always checking in, of course, on how mom's doing and how baby's doing, right? But if everybody's doing okay, then it's a great opportunity to take a nap.
Absolutely.
Get into water.
Phase of descent, and just you can see labors can, completely peter off to nothing. And you just, that's all right. It's a cup of tea time for everybody, and allow that as soon as that sort of baby gets that little bit lower, and it triggers the pelvic floor. And now let me see what else we've got here. Other questions.
No,
sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, I want to answer that question because it was a good question. Because how can we support an intact perineum? So ideally, we were waiting for that, right? Or remember how I mentioned? So we just go back to the baby. I follow the baby. I mean, honestly, because it's going to tell you so much. The clues are all with the baby. So, so if those contractions go away, maybe the uterus has to tighten up around the baby, right? Because it's, the cervix has not traveled up to create that nice thick fundus before those expulsion contractions. So understanding, maybe we have to wait for the uterus. Maybe we have to wait for that baby that has been in a state of flexion for most of the labor, right? Which is normal for a mammal. And now it has to begin to extend to come underneath the pubic symphysis. Now, if we start pushing when the baby is still in a state of flexion, we're going to be pushing for much longer. Plus, we're not going to be having as much sensation of pressure. But as this baby starts beginning to extend and slide across the perineum, right, then that's when that's when the baby's on the perineum, most moms will have some type of pressure, even with an epidural, or they'll have more sensation. So following the NICE guidelines, you wait until you see baby, until like the baby's on the perineum, right? And then you ideally then if you have to push, you're pushing, but until the baby's like sliding across the perineum, you're waiting for that perineum to soften and thin and efface, just like the cervix needed time to soften and thin and efface and stretch around the baby, right? But then once you're seeing baby's head, this is the part. So once the baby begins to crown, then you want to yield. The uterus is already working, so you don't want to add extra force to the uterus. And then ideally, blow itty bitty birthday candles or pants to let the baby birth without. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, because that's that point where we don't want them pushing anymore, and we want them to just blow it through. And one of the things I would say to women is, I want you to blow a cloud across the sky as hard as you can.
I love that.
So it'd be like,
oh yes, yes.
Because you can't blow and push at the same time.
Yeah, I like the idea of, like when we were kids and we would take like a glass Coke bottle. I don't drink Coke anymore, but we'd make that sound.
Yeah.
Possible. That's also a way that, because then you recruit in those deep transverse abdominals. So we don't want to be pushing forward into the belly. We do want to be engaging our deep transverse abdominals, but relaxing everything from below the navel. So when you make that sound, blowing the cloud across the sky, you're recruiting those upper recti abdominals, but you kind of, there's a little beach ball belly that's happening, right? Because you're relaxing everything from below the navel. Because remember, we want to let the baby out.
Yeah, right. Oh, we are getting so close to the end of our time. Let me see what else we've got. It's just been so great, Chantal. So a couple of questions here. What are some good positions to spend time at home during the day? I think we've talked about that, so that's really good, as opposed to slouching that so you've talked about. Look, it's that whole knees below your hips is what I would sort of often say to women. So it's that sort of leaning forward rather than leaning back. And
here in New York City, I say, take the man's play. Everybody, all the men on the subway are like this, and the women are like this, and I'm like, man's play.
That's lovely. It's really good. Can you offer any exercises that this call that we start? Are there any exercises that you would particularly start to integrate earlier in the pregnancy, or it's kind of like we almost don't want exercises towards that last trimester of the pregnancy, because that's the whole thing. We want the pelvic floor to not be strong. We want it to be soft and yielding. But what's your thoughts about doing pelvic floor exercises earlier in the pregnancy, or any other exercises in pregnancy?
Yeah, well, I think of it soft and pliable, strong but supple. We don't want it hypotonic, like super rigid. We want that kind of, people often say like a jellyfish vibe. So what kind of exercises?
What do you suggest that they do?
Pelvic breath. It's always back to the breath, because so the breath is what gets, it's what gets you through the labor. So when my clients lose themselves, come back to your breath. When it comes to feeling safe, right? It's about the breath. When it comes to pelvic floor health, the breath, it does so much, the breath. So if we can start, and I used to call them strategies, but now I'm like, it's a practice, especially now during COVID. Like, this is so important. And if we start now while we're pregnant, it will help us for birth. It will help us for postpartum. It will help us, just the rest of our lives. So I have my clients, and I can grab my bolster, it's just in the other room, but I have my clients kind of like in that throne position. I can send an image of what that looks like. Oh, I'll share an image of what that looks like.
Okay, that would be great.
Let me just share my screen to kind of please share one. Whoops, I just want to wait, not there. Just find that one image. Okay. Yeah. Here's a couple of ideas for lengthening the pelvic floor. And yes, like Kathy, I would have to be more of an incline, even though ACOG, now says that a pregnant mom can be on her back for 2 to 3 minutes. Always talk to your provider first, but you can put a bolster underneath you to raise your organs like above the pelvis.
Even sort of getting just about a 30-degree angle, sort of at a minimum, makes that big difference.
Okay, so I'll change that. But yeah, like this position with the bolster, you can do a happy baby pose there. But in this position, you can just focus on inhaling, and you want to think about, there we go back to that sacred diamond where we have our tailbone, our pubic symphysis, and our 2 sit bones, and that's where the superficial muscles of the pelvic floor attach. And if we think about when we inhale, we want to feel those sit bones broaden and widen. We want to find our tailbone and our pubic symphysis moving away from each other. And then as we exhale, it just comes to neutral. So you don't have to do a pelvic floor contraction. The way that I would rather introduce pelvic floor contraction, so you can do that lying down, that we could do that sitting. Inhale, feel your sit bones widen. Exhale, they come to neutral. Inhale, feel that pelvic floor, that sacred diamond widening. Exhaling, it just comes to neutral. You can feel your sit bones just come slightly back together. It's very subtle. But if you wanted to do pelvic floor contraction, make it functional. So for example, if I was going to stand up from this chair, right, I'm not going to kind of use my arm to get up, right? It just puts more pressure on the pelvic floor. I'd kind of come forward to the edge of the seat, lean into my feet. Inhale, feel my sit bones expand. Exhale, I'm going to engage my abdominals and lift my pelvic floor to stand up, and inhale, expand. So how many times do we get up and down a day? That could be your pelvic floor contraction. You don't have to add on more. Just make it functional.
Right. And I think that the lying down picture that you've got there with the bolsters, when she's on her back on an incline, that's an awesome position for that sort of end of pregnancy, especially with your knees out wide like that, because you sort of just everything's being stretched out, and you can meditate through that, and as you say, focus on your breath, and that's actually far better than than doing your Kegels.
Okay, I'll take it away.
I think that's lovely. That's really I love that position. It's absolutely fantastic. Because that's we've got that question coming through is, can we hear about exercises that focus at the end of the pregnancy, and that is a real winner.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back.
Really good.
We can absolutely. Do they want to do that? We can absolutely kind of think about it. So I really want my students to really understand, because I think when you understand, you get it and it makes sense. So if we think about the pelvic floor, and I think about letting the baby out, we're thinking about relaxing everything from the navel to the knees. So you're relaxing everything down. So what can we do to create that kind of suppleness and that length, right? We don't want weakness, but we don't want tightness. So I always start off with the feet. I'm like, I don't know what the weather's like there. In the summer, I was encouraging my clients, get out, walk barefoot on the grass, walk barefoot on, the earth, walk barefoot on the sand. But we want to kind of roll out our feet, as much as possible. So whether you use a golf ball is a little bit strong, but sometimes just a fascia ball to be able to roll out the feet. I start there, just rolling out the feet. So you could start with like a few minutes a day, just kind of rolling out your feet. because the soles of feet, it all connects up into the pelvic floor. So I start from the ground up, always from the ground up. For me, that's my approach. And then we go to the calf muscles. So we want to be able to stretch our calf muscles. And one of my favorite tools are these hop rounds. Is when you, and I have my clients either put it when they at the bathroom sink, when they're brushing their teeth, or at their desk, or on their phone. And you want to ease into it. So our calves get tighter during pregnancy because of the extra weight, but our calves kind of connect all the way up into the pelvic floor. So we want to find length in the calf muscles. So I have them, build up to, I start 30 seconds each side and build up to 2 or 3 minutes. The most important part here is we're not jamming our tailbone in. We want to think of the tailbone moving a little bit. We want to find movement in that tail, wag your tail a little bit so that we're relaxing here. Like you can lift your pubic bone up a little bit, but you want to get that length in the calf. And going back to that sit-in, one thing that I learned a long time ago is like when you see, like if you have a cat or a dog as a pet, they never sit in there on their tailbone. They never do. They always kind of lift their tailbone before they sit down. So imagine that you're like a regal cat and lift your tailbone before you sit down. And that will always remind you, to kind of get your tailbone out of the way. But then moving along.
Like we need to have a tail that we could get out of the way. And I love that analogy. That's just wonderful. Gosh, it's been so great, and these really practical little exercises and things to do, because so often women want something concrete that they can do.
I'll give one more because I give in my classes a whole lot, but this one I think is really, really important.
Okay.
Really important is we are always told to kind of strengthen our adductors, lift the inner thighs, engage them. But when it comes to giving birth, we want to let the baby out. And often what I notice when my clients are pushing, for example, it's all in the legs. And I have to run it. Relax your legs, relax your legs. You want to let the baby out. If you push it in your legs, you're working against yourself. You're pulling in and up. And so finding length in the adductors. So you could take you could hold on to the back of a couch, but just finding length. As long as you don't have any pubis dysfunction, right? You want to be careful that you're drawing the leg back and you're drawing your 2 pubic bones towards each other. But you want to find length on that inside of the inner thigh. So think about finding length, and you just hold and breathe. You could hold onto your bed or a table. You don't have to get so low. This way. And get that length, because we want to be able to relax these muscles that connect right up into the pelvic floor to find length and release. So there's lots and lots of others.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you so much, Chantal. It's just so good. We are going to have to wind it up, and we haven't managed to get through all the questions. There is going to be information that you the attendees will receive tomorrow into your inbox. So there's more stuff that we'll be handing over to you. Quick question, do you recommend long walks closer to due date? What's the walking? Because obviously stretching.
Yeah. Walking is great. Walk yourself into labor. I think it's great. I mean, obviously start at your level and build up, but walking is just fabulous, unless you have some type of pain, because when we ambulate, that's actually hard. But
that's sciatica pain or and so I mean, if it's, I absolutely agree with you. If it's comfortable to walk, go for it. If it's not comfortable, don't. It's just aggravating everything. And usually the more pregnancies that you have, the more uncomfortable walking becomes. One last little question that we've got here that we'll wind up with, because I think it's a really interesting one. I'm just going to read it straight out from Robin. Hi, Chantal. So glad you're doing this. Do you find most OBs and labour and delivery nurses that your clients are working with when they are in labor, who are mostly insisting on directing that pushing for all their patients. So do you find that they are receptive to your pushing techniques and recommendations while she is pushing, or do you kind of find that collegial kind of, I'm going to tell her how to do it? How do you find it in the cold face working with this kind of conversation on birthing suite?
Well, okay, so there's different angles here. Like I'm lucky in a way that having been a doula for almost 20 years, I've built a lot of relationships with like OBs and midwives. So a lot of the OBs that I work with and refer to me, they know that I want to work, and they're like, okay, Chantal's here. She's gonna help you push. Like,
trust you. Yeah.
Yeah, they trust me, and they know that, I think if you're pushing effectively, they'll let you do whatever you want to do. But if you're not, then they're going to take charge. Here in New York City, and I don't know around like where you are, where this question's coming from, but here a lot of with the group practices, a lot of the OBs don't come in until like the baby's crowning. So you're pushing with the nurse.
Right.
So establish a relationship with the nurse. And I find you're going to get all kinds of the nurse or the midwife. Like the midwives tend to be much more there and more hands-on. Often the OBs will come right at the end. But so just kind of get a sense when you're in the room and it's getting closer to that point, and that person's going to be there for in terms of figuring out the shifts, they're going to be there with you. Then just talk to them about it. Like, I really want to push, in different positions. I want to push spontaneously. I might not be able to hold my breath to the count of 10, so I'm going to let my breath out at 7 seconds. So, as long as I'm pushing effectively, I want support with that. Will you help me with that? And when it comes to the crowning, I always say, have these conversations ahead of time. Don't assume anything. Don't wait for the last minute. Express that I want to ease my baby out. Help me ease my baby out. I will work hard to help drive the baby down. But then when the baby's ready to crown, I want you to tell me when to stop pushing. If you have an epidural, tell me when to stop so that I have time to ease my baby out.
Yeah, and through your perineum.
Yeah.
Look, we're going to have to wind it up. But look, thank you so much for everybody being here today. It's just, it's there's obviously quite a bit to coordinate these webinars, and having you guys here and live is just so welcomed. And obviously we get a lot of people that watch it afterwards as well. And you'll get tomorrow in an email details on the link to be able to rewatch it. But look, and thank you, Chantal, for sharing your knowledge. And I think we've all picked up a lot of wonderful practical hints and tips that we can pass on. Is there anything else that you would like to you finish up with? Anything else that you think we've missed?
Well, afterwards, I think all the questions, there's a lot of questions. And again, there's so much to cover. My classes are sometimes 3 hours long. So, reach out, ask questions. I have a Facebook group called Pushing Power Community. You can join, ask your questions there. I can always pop in little videos, answer questions.
With your Facebook group, what we could do is actually include that link to it within our email tomorrow with everybody, so they'll be able to connect in it to that group if you want.
Yeah, ask questions. Ask your questions there, but great.
Oh, it's just fabulous. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and I hope to see you next week. And thank you all for being here with us. And thank you, Chantal.
Pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.